From mercantilist policies in early modern Europe to the protectionist spirals of the 20th century, nations have frequently used tariffs and trade barriers to shield domestic industries, assert economic dominance, and retaliate against rivals. The post-World War II era marked a turning point as it established a rules-based international trading system designed to prevent the destructive protectionism of the past. Yet, in recent years, economic nationalism has re-emerged. It has challenged the liberal economic order. Today, the first part of this video explores the history of tariffs and trade barriers. It will focus on the experiences of the United States and Britain and examine how the modern global trading system emerged and why it faces new pressures now. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, European powers adopted mercantilism. It is an economic doctrine that views trade as a zero-sum game. Nations sought to maximize exports while minimizing imports. They accumulated gold and silver as measures of wealth. Britain's Navigation Acts 1651 to 1660 restricted trade to British ships. This is how they ensured that colonial wealth flowed back to the mother country. The Colbertism of France imposed high tariffs in order to protect domestic industries. Spain's monopoly system extracted wealth from the Americas while restraining colonial economic development. These policies fueled colonial exploitation and frequent trade wars, thereby setting the stage for future protectionist clashes. In time, there was to be a shift towards free trade under Britain's leadership. By the early 19th century, economic thinkers like Adam Smith in his book The Wealth of Nations and David Ricardo in his comparative advantage theory argued that free trade benefited all nations. Britain's repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 marked a significant shift which dismantled agricultural tariffs in favor of cheaper food imports. The Cobden-Chevalier Treaty of 1860 between Britain and France reduced tariffs, which sparked a wave of bilateral trade agreements. For a time, free trade seemed unstoppable until war and economic crisis reversed the trend. The early 20th century was a period of dramatic upheaval in global trade. The gold standard, which had facilitated stable exchange rates and relatively free commerce in the late 19th century, came under severe strain after World War I. The war itself had disrupted trade networks, which led to massive inflation and left European economies destroyed. In the aftermath, nations scrambled to rebuild, but instead of cooperation, they increasingly turned inward and adopted protectionist policies that would ultimately deepen the Great Depression and contribute to the economic instability fueling World War II. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed heavy reparations on Germany. It crippled its economy and destabilized Europe. Meanwhile, the US, having emerged as the world's leading creditor, initially supported European recovery but soon retreated into isolationism. The conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles led to hyperinflation in Germany by 1923. The Weimar Republic printed money to pay reparations, which led to economic collapse. Meanwhile, Britain was struggling to return to the gold standard by 1925. Winston Churchill's decision to restore the pre-war pound to gold parity made British exports uncompetitive. France was taking a protectionist turn too. After currency devaluation in 1928, the French government imposed tariffs to protect its industries. These policies created a dangerous cycle. Countries raised trade barriers to protect domestic jobs, but this reduced export markets, which consequently led to further economic contraction. Even before the Great Depression, the US had begun retrading from free trade. The Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922 raised duties on agricultural and industrial goods. It aimed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from post-war European competition. This tariff made it harder for nations devastated by the First World War to export to the US. It restrained their recovery. Naturally, there were retaliatory measures. Countries like France and Germany increased their own tariffs and reduced global trade volumes. This early protectionism hinted about the far tougher Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, signed by the President Herbert Hoover, was one of the most strict trade policies in history. It raised US tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to record levels, with average duties exceeding 50% on some products. But why was Smoot-Hawley passed? The simple answer to this question is that there were domestic political pressures. Farmers and manufacturers lobbied for protection against foreign competition. Policymakers believed the tariffs would save jobs but ignored the risk of retaliation. The backlash was swift and severe. Canada imposed tariffs on US goods, which shifted trade to the British Empire. European nations raised their own barrier, with France and Germany adopting strict import quotas. Britain, once the champion of free trade, was forced to withdraw as the global economy collapsed. In 1931, Britain left the gold standard, which devalued the pound to boost exports. And in 1932, the Ottawa Agreements established the imperial preference system. They gave tariff breaks to British colonies while excluding other countries. While this helped British industry temporarily, it fragmented the global economy into competing trade blocs. The British Empire had abandoned free trade entirely and formed a protectionist bloc with its colonies, thereby shutting out US exports. World trade fell by 66% between 1929 and 1934, which worsened the Great Depression. US exports decreased, hurting farmers and industrial workers, which were supposed to be protected by the tariffs. Bank failures spread globally as international credit dried up. Economists like John Maynard Keynes later argued that Smoot-Hawley prolonged the depression by hampering global commerce. The interwar period demonstrated that trade barriers give birth to more trade barriers and consequently create a downward spiral of economic nationalism. There were three key lessons. Firstly, retaliatory tariffs hurt everyone. Exporters lost markets, consumers faced higher prices. Secondly, trade wars deepened economic crisis by reducing demand and investment. And thirdly, isolationism faced problems in an interconnected world because no major economy would thrive alone. These hard-learned lessons shaped the post-World War II economic order, where cooperation, not protectionism, became the guiding principle. As World War II went on intensely, Allied planners, led by the US and Britain, began designing a new international economic system to prevent history from repeating itself. Even before the US formally entered the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill outlined their vision for the post-war world in the Atlantic Charter. Among its key principles were: number 1, access to the trade and raw materials of the world on equal terms and rejecting imperial trade blocs. And number 2, the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field, which was a direct criticism to 1930s isolationism. This document laid the ideological foundation for what would become the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944 established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These institutions were designed to stabilize currencies and finance reconstruction. However, trade was clearly absent from their mandates. Why was there no trade organization finalized in 1944? The answer to this question is that the US congressional opposition would get in the way. Many lawmakers feared surrendering trade policy sovereignty. There was the issue of British reluctance too. The UK was still stuck with imperial trade preferences. The negotiations, in any case, were going to be complex. Trade rules required more time than monetary policy. Thus, trade would be addressed separately, first through bilateral deals, then through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. And so was born GATT. Originally intended as a temporary solution until the International Trade Organization (ITO) could be ratified, GATT became the de facto global trade framework when the ITO failed due to the US Senate opposition. GATT's effectiveness was in its simplicity. Rather than imposing rigid rules, it created a flexible negotiation-based system built on three pillars. Firstly, was the most favored nation MFN in Article 1. Any advantage granted to one member must be extended to all members. For example, if the US cuts tariffs on German cars, the same rate applies to Japanese cars. This rule prevented discriminatory blocs like British imperial preference while allowing gradual liberalization. Second were the tariff bindings of Article 2. Countries agreed to ceiling rates or bound tariffs that could not be exceeded. For example, if Britain bound its wheat tariff at 10%, it could not raise it to 20% without compensating trading partners. This rule created predictability for exporters, reducing the risk of sudden protectionism. The third important rule in GATT was the prohibition of quotas in Article 11. It banned the quantitative restrictions. For example, only 1 million Japanese TVs per year, but exceptions were allowed for agriculture, balance of payment crisis, and later textiles via the multi-fiber arrangement. GATT's architects understood that nations would never fully surrender economic sovereignty. Instead, they crafted a system that channeled protectionism into negotiable, transparent measures. Tariffs were okay, quotas were bad. Tariffs, that are also known as taxes, were permitted but subject to gradual reduction, while quotas, bans, were largely prohibited. Reciprocity was not the same as tit for tat. Negotiations followed a principle of diffuse reciprocity. Countries did not demand exact trade balance equivalence but aimed for mutual gains over time. There were exceptions for emergencies. Countries could temporarily raise barriers for balance of payment crisis under Article 12 or farm safeguards under Article 11. The Kennedy round of negotiations from 1964 to 1967 demonstrated GATT's potential as it achieved average tariff cuts of 35% on industrial goods and thereby making the first major effort to address non-tariff barriers. However, GATT struggled with agricultural subsidies and textile quotas as evidenced by the US and EU farm protections and the multi-fiber arrangement that exempted textiles from GATT rules for decades. As tariffs declined, the countries developed new forms of protectionism like voluntary export restraints and local content requirements that exploited GATT's limitations. These workarounds highlighted the system's inability to keep pace with creative protectionist measures. During the 1970s and 1980s, Japan's auto industry experienced tremendous growth, becoming a major global competitor. Companies like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan implemented innovative lean manufacturing techniques and produced fuel-efficient vehicles that were particularly appealing during the 1973 oil crisis. Their labor law costs compared to American automakers allowed them to offer competitive pricing. As a result, Japanese auto exports to the US grew dramatically from about 1 lakh vehicles in 1967 to over 2 million by 1980, capturing more than 20% of the US market. This rapid expansion triggered a strong backlash from the American auto industry, which faced significant plant closures and job losses. However, instead of imposing outright tariffs that would violate GATT rules prohibiting quotas, the US and Japan negotiated a system of voluntary export restraints. Under the 1981 agreement, Japan agreed to limit its auto exports to 1.68 million vehicles per year. This creative workaround allowed both countries to avoid a formal trade violation while still addressing domestic political pressures in the US. The export restraints had several unintended consequences. They led to higher car prices for American consumers, with studies showing prices increased by about $1,000 per vehicle. Japanese automakers responded by shifting their focus to higher-end, more profitable models, giving rise to luxury brands like Lexus and Acura. Meanwhile, some American automakers became complacent, delaying needed innovations under the assumption that trade protections would continue indefinitely. The European Economic Community, established by the 1957 Treaty of Rome, made progress in eliminating tariffs between the member states but still faced significant trade barriers. different national regulations such as France's pasta laws and Germany's beer purity rules, along with the various hidden trade barriers, continued to hinder commerce. By the 1980s, these non-tariff barriers were estimated to cost European economies about 5% of GDP. The Single European Act of 1986 launched an ambitious effort to create a fully integrated market by 1992. This initiative introduced several key reforms, including the principle of mutual recognition, where products legally sold in one member state had to be accepted in all others. The European Union also worked to harmonize standards across areas like product safety and environmental protection while establishing the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor. These changes produced significant economic benefits, with intra-EU trade increasing by more than 20% by 1996 and cross-border investment flourishing as companies expanded operations across the continent. However, while the European Union became more open internally, it maintained protective trade policies externally, particularly through its common agricultural policy subsidies and anti-dumping measures against imports from countries like China. The Brexit vote in 2016 represented the first major reversal of this integration, with the UK choosing to leave European Union partly due to concerns about sovereignty and regulations. The subsequent decline in UK-EU trade demonstrated the economic costs of unwinding such deep economic integration. These two historical examples illustrate several important lessons about trade policy. Number 1. Protectionism tends to adapt when formal barriers are restricted, thereby finding expression through alternative measures like voluntary export restraints. And number 2. Deep economic integrations requires countries to surrender some degree of sovereignty, which can eventually trigger political backlash. Finally, even systems designed to promote free trade often maintain protections for certain sensitive sectors, showing how trade rules are never completely neutral. These cases demonstrate that trade liberalization rarely proceeds in a straight line, often generating reactions, workarounds, and unintended consequences that shape future policy developments. The complex interplay between economic integration and political realities continues to influence trade relations today. By the 1980s, GATT faced new challenges from unregulated service trade, intellectual property issues, and persistent agricultural disputes. The Uruguay Round from 1986 to 1994 addressed these gaps by creating the World Trade Organization in 1995. The WTO introduced the single undertaking approach, requiring members to accept all agreements, establishing a stronger dispute settlement system, and created new agreements covering services, intellectual property, and agriculture. While the WTO achieved significant successes, including dramatic reductions in global tariffs, it also faced notable failures like the collapse of the Doha Round and the rise of regional trade agreements that bypassed the multilateral system. Ongoing tensions between major trading partners continue to test the system's adaptability. The post-1945 system of global trade, which was brought about through GATT and later World Trade Organization, succeeded where the approach of the 1930s failed. The new system managed protectionism rather than banning it outright. By allowing controlled tariffs, negotiated exceptions, and gradual liberalization, it prevented trade wars while expanding global commerce. Yet, today's challenges, geopolitical rivalry, industrial subsidies, climate policies, test the system's limits. The question is no longer whether trade rules work, but whether they can adapt fast enough to a fragmenting world economy.